The year is 1783. A ship called the Brooks sits docked in Liverpool, England. From the outside, it's a merchant vessel like any other, 25 feet wide, 100 feet long, with 3 masts reaching toward gray British skies. But below deck, something horrific is being constructed. Carpenters are installing wooden platforms between the floors, creating shelves for human beings. They're measuring spaces 6 feet long by 16 inches wide for each man. That's less room than a modern bathtub, less room than a coffin. This isn't a ship. It's an industrial machine designed to turn 454 kidnapped human beings into profit. Between 1700 and 1808, the peak years of the transatlantic slave trade, approximately 12.5 million Africans were forced onto ships and transported across the ocean. Nearly 2 million of them, about 14%, died during the crossing. These weren't just numbers in a ledger. They were people. Farmers, parents, children, healers, warriors. Every one of them had a name, a home, a language, a life before they were dragged to the coast. And the ships that carried them operated on a simple, brutal principle. Maximize cargo, minimize space, accept the losses. Because to the captains and merchants who ran this trade, human beings were just that, cargo. And like any cargo, the goal was to pack as many as possible into every available inch. Let me tell you how it worked. Let me show you the machine. It starts on the coast of West Africa. Kingdoms like Dahomey, trading posts along the Gold Coast, the rivers of Angola, European traders, British, Portuguese, Spanish, French, Dutch, had been operating here for decades. They'd built fortresses on the shoreline called barracoons, stone prisons with iron gates and dark cellars. Inside, kidnapped Africans waited. Some had been captured in warfare. Others were seized by rival tribes and sold for guns, rum, cloth, beads. Still others were simply walking home one day when slave catchers grabbed them. Records from one British trader in 1790 show that out of 939 people purchased, 203 died before they even made it to the ships. That's more than 20%, dead from disease, malnutrition, beatings, or sheer despair in those coastal prisons. The mortality rate in the barracoons was so high that one historian compared it to Europe's Black Death, which killed 40% of the population in the 14th century. Then came the boarding. Witnesses described the sound as unbearable, the wailing of people being torn from land, from everything they knew, forced onto vessels they'd never seen before. Many had never even seen the ocean. They didn't know what these white men were, where they were going, or if they'd ever return. All they knew was terror. Once aboard, the ship stayed anchored off the coast for weeks, sometimes months, slowly filling with human cargo. Captains waited until they had a full load before making the crossing, because every empty space meant lost profit. During this waiting period, the risk of revolt was highest. The captives could still see land. Boats passed back and forth, and they hadn't yet been broken by the voyage. Approximately 1 in every 10 slave ships experienced some form of resistance during this period. Then the ship set sail. And for the next 6 to 10 weeks, depending on winds and weather, 300 to 600 people lived in hell. Here's how they did it. The lower deck of a slave ship, where most captives were kept, typically had between 4.5 and 5 feet 8 inches of vertical space. That means most people couldn't stand up. They couldn't even sit upright. In many areas, they were forced to lie on wooden planks in rows, chained wrist to wrist, ankle to ankle, packed so tightly that their bodies touched on all sides. The space allocated to each person was roughly 6 feet long by 16 inches wide. For context, a standard bathtub is about 5 feet long and 2.5 feet wide. These people had less space than that. A typical twin bed is 38 inches wide. They had less than half that width. And it got worse. To maximize capacity, ship owners installed platforms, essentially shelves, that cut the vertical space in half. This created a second tier of bodies stacked above the first. Some descriptions mention a perpendicular height of only 2.5 feet between tiers. Picture lying on your back with only 2.5 feet of space above you. You can't roll over. You can't turn your head without hitting wood or another person. You can barely breathe. This method was called tight packing, and it was deliberate. There was an alternative called loose packing, where fewer people were loaded to reduce mortality rates. But most captains believed that even if more people died, the sheer volume of survivors would yield higher profits at auction. One account describes how a packer, a crew member responsible for arranging the captives, would literally beat people's feet with a heavy club to force them to press closer together. Men were usually shackled in pairs, right wrist to left wrist, right ankle to left ankle. Women and children were sometimes left unchained, but locked in separate compartments below deck. The separation meant families were torn apart even on the ship. Mothers couldn't reach their children. Husbands didn't know if their wives were alive. The hold where they were kept had almost no ventilation. Small portholes and gratings in the deck above provided minimal airflow. In tropical heat, the temperature below deck became unbearable. One observer said that after staying in the hold for just 10 minutes, his shirt was soaked through as if he'd dunked it in water. Another account described finding people who had been put below deck healthy at night and were dead by morning, suffocated by the heat and lack of air. The stench was overwhelming. There were no toilets, no sanitation. People urinated and defecated where they lay. Many suffered from seasickness or dysentery, vomiting and excreting uncontrollably. The floors became covered in blood, mucus, vomit, and waste. One ship surgeon described the deck as resembling a slaughterhouse. The smell was so foul that crew members could barely stand to go below, and disease spread like wildfire. Dysentery, known at the time as the bloody flux, was the biggest killer. It came from contaminated food and water, and in the filthy, cramped conditions, it tore through the ship. People became severely dehydrated, weakened, and died within days. When someone got dysentery, they knew they were likely going to die, and many stopped eating altogether, accepting their fate. Smallpox was another terror. Highly contagious, it spread rapidly in close quarters. People developed high fevers and pustular rashes that covered their skin. Without treatment, mortality rates were high, and those who survived were often left disfigured. Measles, scurvy, and a disease called ophthalmia, which caused blindness, also ravaged the ships. Scurvy came from the lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, vitamin C deficiency that caused bleeding gums, loose teeth, and general weakness. The death toll was staggering. In the early decades of the slave trade, around 1700 to 1750, mortality rates averaged above 20%. That means 1 in every 5 people died on the voyage. By 1800, with some improvements in ship design and slightly better provisions, the rate dropped to around 10%. But even that meant that on a ship carrying 400 people, 40 would be dead by the time they reached the Americas. Some voyages were far worse. Bad weather, disease outbreaks, or longer than expected crossings could push mortality rates to 30, 40, even 50%. Captains carried extra shackles, because they expected dozens of deaths. They factored it into their business plans. When someone died, the body was thrown overboard with little ceremony. Sharks followed slave ships across the Atlantic, feeding on the corpses. Food rations were minimal and often rotten. Horse beans, large, foul-tasting beans normally used to feed animals, were boiled with palm oil and red pepper to mask the taste. Many captives refused to eat, some because they were too sick or despondent, others as an act of resistance. When people refused food, crew members used a device like a funnel to force it down their throats. This brutal force-feeding often caused injuries and infections. Water was severely rationed. Ships needed to conserve space for cargo, so water supplies were limited. Dehydration was common, which only made disease worse. The combination of filth, contaminated food, lack of water, and no medical care created an environment where death was constant. Around once a day, weather permitting, captives were brought up onto the main deck for what the crew called exercise. But this wasn't for their health. It was to reduce mortality rates that would hurt profits. Crew members forced people still in chains to jump or dance. Those who refused were whipped. This wasn't compassion. It was asset management. The crew wasn't spared either. Sailors lived in harsh conditions, often without shelter, sleeping on the open deck for the entire voyage. They faced the same diseases that killed the captives: dysentery, malaria, yellow fever, and crew mortality rates were around 20% as well. Many sailors were coerced into service, tricked by recruiters who got them drunk and indebted, then forced them to sign contracts. If they survived, they were often cheated out of their wages when they returned home. Some captains even preferred high crew mortality on the return voyage because it meant fewer wages to pay. But the most remarkable thing, the thing that terrifies slavers and inspires historians, is that despite all of this horror, despite the chains and the guns and the whips and the terror, enslaved Africans resisted constantly. Between 1509 and 1865, historians have documented at least 485 to 493 shipboard rebellions. That's roughly one revolt for every 10 ships. And these numbers are almost certainly low because many successful rebellions left no record. If captives killed the entire crew and sailed back to Africa, who would report it? The ship would simply be listed as missing, lost to a storm or pirates. We'll never know how many times that happened. Most rebellions occurred while the ship was still near the African coast, within sight of land. That's when hope was highest and control was weakest. Captives would find anything, a piece of wood, a tool, a loose nail, and turn it into a weapon. Even children were involved, passing objects between compartments or relaying messages. One of the most famous revolts happened in July 1839 aboard a Spanish ship called La Amistad. 53 Mende people from Sierra Leone had been kidnapped and sold in Cuba, then loaded onto the Amistad for transport to a plantation. 3 days into the voyage, a 25-year-old man named Sengbe Pierre, known to history as Joseph Cinque, found a rusty file. He sawed through his shackles, freed the others, and they armed themselves with cane knives stored on the ship. They killed the captain and the cook, took control of the vessel, and ordered the 2 surviving crew members to sail back to Africa. But the crew tricked them, sailing east during the day toward the sun but steering north at night. 2 months later, the ship was intercepted off Long Island, New York. The Africans were arrested and charged with murder and piracy. But abolitionists rallied to their defense, and in a stunning legal victory, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 1841 that they were free individuals who had been kidnapped illegally and had the right to resist. 35 survivors eventually returned to Sierra Leone. The Amistad case became a symbol, but it wasn't unique. In 1841, another revolt took place aboard the Creole, an American ship transporting 134 enslaved people from Virginia to New Orleans. A man named Madison Washington, who had escaped to Canada once before, led the uprising. He and about 20 others overpowered the crew, killed one trader, and forced the ship to sail to the Bahamas. There, under British law which had abolished slavery, they were freed. Most walked off the ship as free people. Another rebellion occurred in 1721 aboard the British ship Henry. When questioned, the captives said the traders who bought them were rogues, and they were determined to regain their liberty. In 1730, aboard the Little George, enslaved people broke through the bulkhead, fought the crew, and even after a gunpowder explosion nearly destroyed the ship, they steered it back to the African coast and escaped. The captain survived to tell the story, but the captives won their freedom. Historians estimate that about 1/4 of shipboard revolts resulted in at least some captives gaining freedom. That's remarkable, given the overwhelming odds. Crew members were armed with muskets, pistols, swords, and even cannons. Ships carried defensive structures called barricados, 10-foot-tall wooden walls that split the deck and allowed the crew to retreat and fire on the captives. Yet people still fought back. Why? Because even when facing almost certain death, the human spirit refuses to accept bondage. Captive Africans knew what slavery meant. They'd seen people taken before. They understood that if they reached the Americas, they would be worked to death on plantations. And many chose to fight, to die on their feet, rather than live in chains. The economic impact of these revolts was significant. Ships that experienced uprisings often suffered major financial losses. Dead crew members meant lost labor. Damaged ships meant costly repairs. And if the captives succeeded in killing everyone or escaping, the entire cargo was lost. Insurance companies tried to cover these losses, but revolts made the trade riskier and more expensive. Some historians argue that the constant threat of rebellion, combined with the moral campaign of abolitionists, helped bring an end to the trade. In 1807, Britain outlawed the slave trade in its empire. The United States followed in 1808. But slavery itself remained legal in most places, and illegal slave trading continued for decades. Cuba imported enslaved Africans until 1886, Brazil until 1850. The Royal Navy established the West Africa Squadron to intercept illegal slave ships, and between 1808 and 1870, they seized over 1,500 vessels and freed about 150,000 people. But the damage was done. Over 350 years, the transatlantic slave trade ripped roughly 12.5 million people from Africa. Millions more died in the wars, raids, and forced marches to the coast. Entire communities were destroyed. The demographic impact on Africa was catastrophic, depopulating regions and leaving them vulnerable to conquest and exploitation for centuries. And in the Americas, the legacy of slavery shaped everything. The wealth generated from enslaved labor built industries, funded banks, and created generational fortunes that still exist today. Cities like Boston, New York, Charleston, and New Orleans were built on the slave trade. The racial hierarchies established during slavery persist in modern inequalities, mass incarceration, health disparities, wealth gaps. The slave ship is often seen as just a vessel, a means of transportation, but it was more than that. It was a machine of dehumanization, a factory of suffering designed to strip people of their identity, their dignity, their very humanity. It reduced human beings to units of cargo, measured by the inch, valued by the pound, discarded when broken. And yet, in the face of that machine, people resisted. They fought. They refused to be cargo. They held on to their humanity when everything was designed to crush it. The rebellions, the refusals to eat, the leaps overboard, even the quiet acts of kindness between captives sharing water or whispering encouragement in the dark. All of it was resistance. All of it mattered. The story of the slave ship isn't just a story of horror. It's also a story of resilience. It's a reminder that even in the darkest moments, even when every system is designed to break you, the human spirit can endure. And it's a warning about what happens when people are treated as commodities, when profit is valued above life, when one group of humans decides another group isn't fully human. We need to remember these ships. We need to remember the 12.5 million people who were forced onto them. We need to remember the 2 million who died in the crossing. We need to remember their names, even though most are lost to history. We need to remember that they fought, that they resisted, that they were human beings, not cargo. Because if we forget, if we treat this as ancient history that doesn't matter anymore, we risk repeating it. The machinery of dehumanization still exists. It just looks different now. But the lesson is the same. Human beings are not cargo. They never were, and they never will be. The slave ship is gone, but its legacy remains, and so does the legacy of those who fought back. Their resistance didn't end slavery overnight, but it made it impossible to sustain. It gave fuel to abolition movements. It proved that the enslaved were not passive victims, but active agents fighting for their freedom. So when you think of the transatlantic slave trade, don't just think of the horror. Think also of the rebellion. Think of Sengbe P sawing through his chains. Think of Madison, Washington, steering a ship to freedom. Think of the unnamed hundreds who fought and died so that others might live free. That's the story. That's what happened on those ships. And that's why we can never forget. You can click in these other videos if you like this one. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel for more history documentaries.